Can you act like the perfect wife just for 1 week?" The native woman begged, lonely cowboy. The sun had barely risen over the distant hills, casting a warm glow across the vast land. On the ranch, the early morning silence was only broken by the occasional lowing of cattle and the soft creaking of the old wooden fence that stretched across the property. There, standing at the edge of his porch, was a man who had grown used to being alone. He was a cowboy, tough, quiet, and as rugged as the land he called home. His name was Jake. He had been living on this piece of land for as long as he could remember, working the ranch by himself ever since his father had passed away a few years ago. It was a life he had always known, and although he had become accustomed to the solitude, there were days when he couldn't help but feel the sting of loneliness. The long days spent fixing fences, tending to cattle, and repairing equipment were tiring, but they were manageable. What weighed on him more was the silence, the emptiness of a life lived without anyone to share it with. Jake had a few acquaintances, people from nearby towns or the ranchers who lived on the neighboring land, but they were always busy with their own lives. There had been no one to stay by his side, no one to fill the empty space at the table, and certainly no one to love. On one particularly quiet afternoon, as Jake was out by the barn mending a broken fence, he noticed a figure in the distance. It was a woman, walking slowly across the dusty road that led to his ranch. She had a purposeful stride, but there was something about the way she moved that made her seem out of place, as if she didn't belong in this part of the world. Jake's first instinct was to ignore her. He wasn't used to visitors, especially not someone he didn't know. But there was something about the way she walked, the way the wind tugged at her long, dark hair, that caught his attention. As she drew closer, he could see that she was carrying a small bag, worn and weathered, as though she had traveled a long way. She was young, perhaps in her 20s, with dark eyes that seemed to hold a deep sadness. When she finally reached the edge of the property, she stopped and hesitated for a moment, as if deciding whether or not to approach. Jake stood still, watching her from a distance, unsure of what to do. After a long pause, she walked up to him, her gaze never leaving the ground. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft but steady.
I was wondering if I could speak with you for a moment." Jake was surprised.
No one ever came to his ranch unless they needed something. He wiped his hands on his pants and nodded, taking a step forward. "What can I do for you?" The woman looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. I need help."
"I've heard of you, of your kindness.
I know this is a strange request, but I don't know who else to turn to." Jake raised an eyebrow. His curiosity piqued. "What do you need help with?" She hesitated, then spoke, her words careful, as if she had rehearsed them in her mind 1,000 times before. Can you act like the perfect husband, just for 1 week? I need it to look real, like you're my husband, and I'm your wife." Jake stood there, taken aback by her words. "What do you mean?" he asked, confused. She took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. "I've got myself in a difficult situation," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need someone to pretend to be my husband, just for a week. I know it sounds strange, but it's the only way I can get out of this problem. I'm not asking for anything else. Just for a little while." Jake wasn't sure what to make of this request. His first instinct was to refuse. This was absurd. Why would a woman like her need a cowboy like him to pretend to be her husband? But there was something about the desperation in her eyes that made him pause. She looked like someone who had been carrying a heavy burden for far too long, someone who had nowhere else to go. His life was simple. straightforward. There was nothing complicated about it. He didn't need anyone, didn't want anyone, and certainly didn't need to be part of some strange arrangement. Yet here was this woman, asking him for something he never could have imagined. "I don't know what you're asking," he finally said. "Why would you want me to do that?" "You don't even know me." The woman's shoulders slumped, and she looked down at the ground. For a moment, Jake thought she might cry. But she held herself together, looking up at him with a determined expression. "I know it's a lot to ask," she said quietly, "but I don't have any other choice. I need to do this to get out of a bad situation. If you help me, I promise it won't be for long. Just 1 week." Jake didn't know what to say. His mind raced with questions. What was her story? What kind of trouble was she in? Why had she chosen him? But his heart told him something different. There was something in her voice, in her eyes, that made him believe she wasn't lying. Maybe, just maybe, she really needed help. He let out a slow sigh, running a hand through his unkempt hair. "All right," he said, surprising himself. 1 week. But you'd better be clear about what you need, and we'll keep things simple." The woman's face softened, and a faint smile crossed her lips. "Thank you." "You don't know what this means to me." Jake nodded, still unsure of what he had just agreed to, but something in him couldn't turn her away. There was something about her that made him want to help, to see this through. Maybe it was the loneliness he had lived with for so long, or maybe it was just the right thing to do. Either way, he had agreed, and now there was no turning back. As they stood there in silence, the wind picked up, swirling around them. The cowboy and the woman, two strangers brought together by fate, stood on the threshold of an unexpected journey. Neither of them knew where it would lead, but both could feel that this week would change everything. The next morning the sun was already climbing high when Jake heard a soft knock on the door. He had gotten used to the quiet mornings on his ranch, but today felt different. Something about the woman's request from the previous day lingered in his mind. He had agreed to help her, but now that the time had come, he wasn't sure what to expect. He opened the door, and there she was, standing on the porch. Her dark eyes were filled with a mixture of determination and uncertainty, and her worn bag hung by her side. She looked more prepared today, as if she had thought through everything and was ready to begin the strange arrangement. "Good morning," she said softly, her voice almost too gentle for someone about to ask for something so significant. "Morning," Jake replied, his voice gruff as always. He couldn't shake the feeling that today would change everything. She stepped inside, glancing around the house for the first time with a sense of curiosity. It wasn't much. Just a simple ranch house with old wooden floors, a large kitchen area, and a few basic furnishings. Jake didn't need much. He had his cattle, his horses, and his land. The house was a place to sleep and eat. Nothing more. The woman who had introduced herself as Rose the day before seemed to take in the details. Her eyes lingered on the worn furniture and the rustic charm of the house. She walked over to the kitchen counter, touching the edges of the wooden table as if she was becoming familiar with it. Jake didn't know why, but he suddenly felt a bit awkward in his own home. He wasn't used to having company, especially someone like her, someone who wasn't just passing through, but someone who would be here for a week, pretending to be something she wasn't. Not his mind raced with questions. What would this look like? How would they make it work? "So, what exactly are we going to do now?" he asked, breaking the silence. Rose turned to face him, her eyes meeting his with a calmness that surprised him. "We need to start by getting into our roles. I'll be the perfect wife, and you'll be the perfect husband, at least for the next week. It will be like nothing unusual is happening, just like a real marriage." Jake nodded, though he still felt uneasy. This was all so strange to him. He wasn't sure how to act in this pretend marriage. He wasn't the type to go through the motions just for the sake of it. But Rose seemed to believe it was necessary, and for some reason, he felt compelled to follow through. The day passed slowly at first. Rose moved around the house, tidying up here and there, making the bed, sweeping the floors. It wasn't as though she had no experience with household tasks. Jake could tell by the way she moved and worked that she had taken care of herself for a long time. Still, he found himself watching her more than he meant to. She had a certain grace about her, a quiet strength that he admired. He tried to keep himself busy with the chores outside, but his mind kept drifting back to Rose and her request. The idea of pretending, of acting as if they were something they weren't, felt strange. He wasn't sure how long he could keep up this act, but he had promised to help her, and that was what mattered. By the time the sun began to set, Jake had finished his tasks and was back inside. Rose had prepared a simple meal, setting the table as if they were a normal couple. When Jake sat down, he noticed the effort she had put into making everything just right. The meal wasn't much, some stew, bread, and a little fruit, but the way she served it with care made it feel like more. They sat in silence for a while, eating their meal. Jake wasn't sure what to say. This wasn't a real marriage, but it almost felt like it could be. He wasn't used to sharing meals with anyone, and certainly not someone who was pretending to be his wife. Yet, as they ate together, something began to shift. The tension in the air started to fade, replaced by an uneasy but growing sense of comfort. As they finished eating, Rose cleared the table, and Jake found himself picking up a few dishes to help. He wasn't used to anyone doing things for him, but it felt natural to lend a hand. They worked side by side in the quiet of the evening, and for a moment, Jake began to wonder if this could really work. If this was just an act, then why did it feel so real? Later that night, after everything was cleaned up, Rose sat in the small living room, reading a book she had brought with her. Jake watched her for a moment from the doorway. She was so absorbed in the pages, her expression peaceful, almost content. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt that way, truly relaxed and at ease. He didn't want to disturb her, so he went to his room. But as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind couldn't settle. What was really happening here? Rose had come to him asking for help, but there was something more beneath the surface. Something about her wasn't just about needing a place to stay or pretending to be someone she wasn't. There was a quiet pain in her eyes, something she wasn't saying, something that he couldn't yet understand. The days went by and their strange arrangement continued. Rose woke up early each morning, prepared breakfast, and helped with the chores. It was like playing house, like something out of a dream. Jake found himself starting to rely on her more than he had expected, not just for help around the house, but for the quiet companionship. The way she spoke, her kindness, and the calmness she brought to the house made him feel something he hadn't realized he was missing. One evening after dinner, Rose spoke up. "Jake, I know this is all strange, but I want to thank you. I know you didn't have to agree to this. You've been patient with me, and I appreciate that." Jake looked at her, the words catching in his throat. "It's fine. Now, I promised I'd help you. I'm not used to this, but I guess I'm getting used to having someone around." Rose smiled softly, her eyes meeting his. "It's only for a week," she said, almost as if reminding herself, "I don't want to complicate things more than they already are." Jake didn't respond. He didn't know how to. The week had only just begun, but already things were beginning to feel different. What started as a simple favor was turning into something much more complicated. something that neither of them could have predicted. As the week went on, Jake found himself waking up to a routine he never expected. The mornings had started to feel less lonely, less empty. Every day, Rose was there, making breakfast, tidying up, and offering a quiet kind of company that Jake had never experienced. It was a strange feeling, having someone else in his house, but it wasn't unpleasant. She was quiet and gentle in the way she moved about, always doing her part without demanding anything in return. It was like living with a shadow, someone who was present but never intrusive. By the middle of the week, Jake had noticed something else. He was starting to look forward to seeing her, not just for the meals or the tasks she helped with, but because she brought something else with her, something he couldn't quite put into words. There was a calmness about Rose that eased the tension he hadn't even realized he was carrying. She never asked for much, never made demands, but her presence made the house feel less like a place and more like a home. One afternoon, as they worked together in the barn, Jake found himself watching her. She was carefully cleaning out the stables, humming a soft tune as she worked. Her movements were fluid and precise, her hair tied back in a simple braid. There was something peaceful about the way she went about her tasks, as if the world outside didn't matter. It made Jake wonder about her past. What had brought her here, to this strange arrangement with a man she barely knew? "Do you mind if I ask you something?" Jake said, breaking the silence as he picked up a shovel. Rose glanced up at him, her dark eyes full of warmth. "Of course, what is it?" Jake hesitated for a moment, unsure if he should ask. But the question had been lingering in his mind for days. "Why did you come to me? Why didn't you ask someone else for help?" Rose paused, wiping her hands on her apron before answering. "I didn't have a choice. I needed someone who wouldn't ask too many questions. Someone who could help me get away from things I couldn't handle on my own." Her voice was soft, but there was a quiet strength behind it. "I knew I wasn't asking for something simple, but I had to do it. I didn't want anyone to judge me or make me feel like I had to explain everything. You were different." Jake nodded slowly, trying to understand. It made sense now. She wasn't just running away from a problem. She was trying to find a way to move forward, to escape something that had trapped her. But there was more to it than that. Something she wasn't saying. "I don't want to be a burden," Rose continued, her gaze lowering to the ground. "I just needed someone to pretend with for a little while so I could get a fresh start." Jake studied her, sensing that there was more to her story, something deeper, but he didn't press her. He could tell she wasn't ready to share everything yet. Instead, he changed the subject, the awkward silence hanging between them, slowly fading. The rest of the day passed quietly, and when evening came, they shared another meal, this time in the small dining room. It wasn't anything special, just soup and bread. But as they sat together, Jake couldn't help but feel a sense of comfort in the simple act of eating together. It was something he hadn't realized he missed. The presence of another person in the room, sharing a meal, talking about the little things that made up everyday life. As they finished their meal, Rose spoke again. "I never really had a place like this, somewhere peaceful. I've always been moving, always trying to figure things out. It's nice, just being here, even if it's only for a week." Jake looked at her, surprised by her honesty. "I know what you mean. I've lived here a long time, but it's never felt like it's really mine. I just work the land, keep to myself, but you make it feel different." "I didn't expect that." Rose smiled at him, her expression softening. "Maybe that's what we both needed. A change, something different to make us see things in a new way." The words hung in the air, and Jake felt the weight of them. Was she right? Had they both needed this? It was more than just a simple act. more than just a week of pretending. Somewhere along the way, it had become something else. The connection between them had deepened without either of them really noticing. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something important, something that made the days feel less lonely, less disconnected. That night, as Jake lay in bed, he found himself thinking about Rose more than he had before. It wasn't just the way she had stepped into his life so easily, as if she belonged there. It was the way she had filled the empty spaces in his heart, the places he hadn't even known were there. She hadn't tried to change him or his life, but somehow she had made it better. And for the first time in years, Jake felt a sense of hope, something he hadn't felt in a long while. The next morning, they continued their routine, but it wasn't the same. There was a quiet understanding between them now, an unspoken acknowledgement that they weren't just playing a role anymore. They had become something more, partners in this strange temporary life they had built together. And as much as Jake tried to keep things simple, he couldn't ignore the growing feeling in his chest, the way Rose had settled into his life, the way she made everything feel a little brighter. It was hard to deny that he was starting to care for her in a way he hadn't planned on. But he kept his feelings hidden, not yet ready to admit them to himself, let alone to her. He didn't want to complicate things. They had made it this far with the understanding that it was only for a week. But that was the problem. He didn't know what would happen when that week was over. Rose, too, seemed to sense the shift. She no longer seemed like a stranger playing a part. She was starting to feel like a real part of his life, someone who had a place in his world, someone who made it feel whole. And though she never mentioned it, Jake could see the small changes in her too, the way she smiled more often, the way her eyes sparkled when she spoke to him, as if she was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was more to this than just pretending. As the week continued, they both carried on with their roles, but the unspoken bond between them grew stronger. Neither of them said it aloud, but they both knew that this week, this strange experiment, was changing everything. The week was almost over, and neither Jake nor Rose knew how to feel. The days had passed in a blur, a strange mix of routine and unexpected moments of connection. Jake had kept his distance emotionally, reminding himself that it was just a temporary arrangement. But the closer the end of the week came, the harder it became to ignore the growing feelings inside him. Rose had been more than just a guest in his home. She had become part of the rhythm of his days, her laughter filling the quiet house, her soft voice soothing him during long, tiring hours. She had transformed the space around them into something warmer, something alive. It was strange, Jake thought, how easily she had slipped into his world, how quickly she had become a presence he relied on. And now, with the week almost finished, he wasn't sure what to do with the emotions swirling inside him. He couldn't deny that he had grown fond of her. There were moments when he caught himself watching her, her eyes focused as she worked, or when she would smile at him with a genuine warmth that made his heart feel lighter. The connection between them had deepened in ways he hadn't expected. But with the week coming to an end, Jake felt a sense of unease growing inside him. What would happen when she left? Could he go back to the way things were? Or had this week changed something permanent? One evening, as they sat on the porch after dinner, the sun dipping low on the horizon, Rose turned to Jake. The silence between them was comfortable, but there was something unsaid in the air, a tension that neither of them could ignore.
Jake, Rose began, her voice soft but steady, I know this wasn't supposed to be real.
But, she paused, looking out at the sunset. It feels real, doesn't it? Jake swallowed hard, his gaze shifting from the view to her face. Her eyes were filled with something he hadn't seen before. Vulnerability, maybe, or a quiet fear. It does. he said quietly, his heart pounding in his chest. But it's not real, Rose. It's just, it's just been a week. She nodded slowly, as if accepting what he said, but Jake could tell it wasn't enough for her. I know, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper, but I don't want it to end. I don't want to go back to what it was before. Jake's heart twisted at the words, tried to keep his emotions at bay, tried to tell himself that it was all temporary, that once the week was over, everything would go back to the way it was. But hearing Rose say those words made him realize how much he had come to care for her. He wasn't used to opening up to anyone, especially not like this. But something about Rose made him feel safe, made him feel like it was okay to admit what he had been feeling. I don't want you to leave either, he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. But you have to.
We agreed. This was just for 1 week.
Rose looked at him, her eyes searching his face for something he wasn't sure he could give. I don't want to go back to a life where I'm alone, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I don't know where to go after this. I don't have anywhere else to turn. Jake's mind raced as he took in her words. He could feel the weight of her confession, the burden she carried. He could see it now, how much she had been running away from, how much she had been trying to escape. It wasn't just about pretending to be a wife. It was about finding a way out of the pain, the isolation, the loneliness. She had come to him because, for a brief moment, she had found a place where she didn't have to be alone. Jake stood up, pacing for a moment. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, and he felt like he was stuck in a place between wanting to help her and knowing that this was a temporary arrangement. He had never been good at navigating feelings, at knowing what to say or do, but one thing was clear. He didn't want to lose this. He didn't want to go back to the silence, to the emptiness he had lived with for so long. I don't know what's going to happen when this week is over, Jake said finally, turning to face her. But I do know that I don't want you to leave. Rose's eyes softened, and for a moment it felt like everything between them hung in the balance. The unsaid words, the unspoken connection, it was all there, waiting to be acknowledged. But the reality of the situation loomed over them both, like a shadow they couldn't escape. I don't know what to do either, Rose said quietly. I never expected to feel this way. I thought it would be easy, just pretend for a week, and then go back to my life. But now I don't know if I can let go of what we've had here. Jake's heart was heavy with the weight of her words. He didn't have answers, didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing. He couldn't go back to how things were before she had come into his life. The quiet, lonely days were no longer enough. He didn't want to live like that anymore. I'm not asking for anything, Jake, Rose continued, her voice trembling, but I can't just walk away from something that feels real. Jake's chest tightened at the pain in her voice. He took a step closer, reaching out to gently take her hand. I don't want to walk away from this either, he said softly, but I don't know what comes next. They stood there for a moment, their hands touching, the world around them fading away. Neither of them had the answers, but in that moment, they both understood something important. They weren't ready to let go of what they had, not yet. As the days continued to pass, the weight of the approaching end loomed larger. Neither of them spoke much more about it, but the quiet tension remained. They went through their routines, the days blending together, but the feeling between them was different now. There was a deeper understanding, an acknowledgement that this wasn't just a pretend marriage anymore. It was something more, something neither of them had expected. And as the final day of the week arrived, neither Jake nor Rose knew what to do. The time had come to face the reality of their situation, but neither of them was ready to say goodbye. The final day had arrived, and it felt as though the world was holding its breath. Jake and Rose had spent the last week in a strange yet comforting rhythm. The days were simple, their time together filled with shared moments, small conversations, and the quiet understanding that things between them had shifted in ways neither of them could fully explain. That morning, the air was crisp as they worked in the barn. The sun had just started to rise, casting golden light across the land. Rose was already busy, brushing down the horses, her movements graceful and steady, as always. Jake watched her for a moment, his mind swirling with the knowledge that this would be the last day they spent together in this way, the last day they would pretend. For a moment he wondered if she would be gone by evening. She would pack her things, say her goodbyes, and leave. And he would return to the quiet, empty life he had known before. The thought of it felt like a weight on his chest. He didn't want to go back to that, to the silence and the solitude. He didn't want to lose her, but he didn't know how to ask her to stay. The week had been too short, too sudden, and yet, in some strange way, it had felt like a lifetime. Rose looked up from the horse, catching his gaze. She smiled softly, and for a moment, everything felt normal again. She had a way of making the simplest moments feel special, like she had the ability to fill even the quietest spaces with warmth. "Jake," she said, breaking the silence, her voice quiet but steady. "I know we said it was only for a week, but,
I don't want to leave. Not yet."
Jake's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure how to respond. The week had flown by, and now, as they faced the reality of the end, it felt impossible to imagine life without her. "I don't want you to leave either," he said, his voice rough with emotion. He ran a hand through his hair, his thoughts racing. "But we agreed this would just be for 1 week. I don't know what's next, Rose. I don't know how to fix this feeling I have. I never expected any of this." Rose walked over to him slowly, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to read his thoughts. "Neither did I," she admitted, "but I can't help how I feel. I felt seen for the first time in so long. It's not just about the act, Jake. It's about what we've shared. I don't know where this goes, but I don't want to leave either." Jake stood there, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. He had never been good with emotions, never known what to say when faced with feelings he couldn't control. But now, standing before Rose, he felt something stir deep within him. A longing, a hope, that maybe, just maybe, there was more to this than he had allowed himself to believe. "I don't want to go back to being alone," he said quietly, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't want to go back to the silence." Rose's eyes softened and she reached out, her hand brushing against his. The simple touch was enough to convey everything they couldn't put into words. It was a silent promise, a shared understanding that neither of them was ready to say goodbye. "We don't have to go back to that," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "We can figure this out together. I'm not asking for everything. I'm just asking for a chance to see what this could be, a chance to not be alone anymore." Jake swallowed hard, his chest tightening. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to take that chance, to step into something unknown, something that could change everything. But it felt risky, uncertain, like jumping into a river without knowing what was at the bottom. "I don't know how to do that," Jake said, his voice filled with doubt. "I've never done anything like this. I don't know what it means to have someone. I've spent so long thinking I didn't need anyone. But now that I've had you here, I don't know how to let go." Rose smiled softly, her expression full of understanding. "You don't have to let go. We don't have to figure it all out in one day."
But I can't keep pretending it's just a game. I want more, Jake.
I want something real. Jake looked at her, really looked at her. And for the first time, he saw the woman standing in front of him. Not just the stranger who had come to him for help, not just the role she had played, but the person she had become in the short time they had shared. She had become a part of his life in ways he hadn't expected. And now, he couldn't imagine a life without her in it. Maybe we don't have to figure it all out right now, Jake said slowly, his voice filled with the realization that this was something he couldn't walk away from. Maybe we just take it one step at a time. Rose's eyes brightened, and she stepped closer, closing the distance between them. One step at a time, she repeated softly. The silence that followed wasn't awkward or uncomfortable. It was filled with the unspoken understanding that they both had a long way to go, but they were willing to take that journey together. There were no promises, no guarantees, but in that moment, they both knew that the week had changed them in ways they couldn't deny. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the stars began to appear in the clear night sky, Jake and Rose sat on the porch together. The house was quiet, but the air was full of possibility. They didn't talk much. There was no need to. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was peaceful. The week had ended, but in many ways, it felt like a new beginning. They had both changed, both grown, in ways they couldn't have anticipated. And as they sat there, side by side, they didn't need to say anything more. They had already made their choice. They had already decided that the time they had spent together was just the beginning of something new. For the first time in a long time, Jake didn't feel alone. And for Rose, the future no longer seemed like a place to escape from. It felt like a place to move forward, together. And that, for both of them, was enough. The days that followed felt like they were stretching out before them, full of uncertainty, but also of quiet possibility. Jake and Rose had come to an unspoken understanding, but neither of them knew exactly what the future would hold. The week they had spent together had been full of both comfort and tension, a strange mix of pretending and something real that neither of them had expected. On the morning after their quiet conversation, where they had both admitted how much they didn't want the arrangement to end, Rose got up early as usual, her routine unchanged. She went about the house, making breakfast and tidying up, but there was a new energy to her movements. She wasn't pretending anymore, not in the way she had at first. There was something different in the air between them, an understanding that neither could ignore. Jake, too, felt the change. He had always been a man of few words, content with his own company, but now he found himself watching Rose more than he intended to. She moved through the house with a grace that he hadn't noticed before. The way she hummed softly while working, the way her smile seemed to brighten the room. It was these small things that began to make him realize how much he had come to depend on her presence. As the morning passed, they shared breakfast together. There were no words at first, just the simple clink of forks against plates. But after a while, Jake cleared his throat, unsure of how to begin. "Rose, I've been thinking," he started, looking down at his plate as he spoke. "I don't know what happens next, but I can't just pretend anymore. I don't want you to leave." Rose looked up at him, her eyes meeting his with the same warmth that had been there since the first day she arrived. She had always been able to read him, to see through the walls he had built around himself.
"I don't want to leave either," she said quietly, "but we both know it's complicated."
"I can't ask you for something you're not ready to give." Jake looked at her, his chest tight. He wanted to say the right thing, but the words felt like they were stuck in his throat. For the first time, he felt vulnerable, unsure of how to express what had been growing inside him all week. "I'm not asking for anything either," Jake said slowly, "but I can't go back to being alone. Not after all of this. After having you here. Rose's heart fluttered at his words. She had known that something was changing between them, but hearing him say it aloud made it real. It was a simple truth, but it was enough. They didn't have to know exactly where they were headed, but at least they both understood that the connection they had built was not something they were willing to give up.
For the next few days, things remained quiet, but the silence wasn't the same as before.
There was no longer a sense of waiting for something to end, no longer a feeling that they were just passing time. They began to make plans, small ones at first. Rose suggested a visit to town to get supplies, and Jake agreed. It was something simple, but for both of them, it felt like a step forward. They had always kept to themselves, but now they were making decisions together, as if they had become partners in something bigger than the arrangement they had started with. The town was small, just a few shops and a handful of people. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, and where strangers stood out. Jake and Rose walked through the streets together, the warm sun on their faces, the sound of their footsteps echoing on the cobblestone paths. People glanced at them, some with curiosity, others with a knowing smile, but neither Jake nor Rose felt uncomfortable. It was as if they had stepped into a new world, a world where they didn't have to pretend anymore. As they entered the general store, Jake noticed that Rose seemed more at ease than she had been in days. She picked up items from the shelves, chatting with the shopkeeper and smiling in a way that made Jake feel something he hadn't felt in a long time. A sense of belonging. She wasn't just pretending anymore. She was part of this life, this world. And for the first time, Jake realized that he wanted her to stay in it. When they returned to the ranch, the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden light across the land. They stood on the porch for a moment, taking in the view. The peaceful quiet of the ranch had always been Jake's refuge, but now, with Rose beside him, it felt different. It felt like home.
"I've been thinking," Rose said, breaking the silence. She paused, taking a deep breath.
I don't know what will happen with us, Jake, but I don't want to keep pretending. Not anymore. I want to see where this can go. Jake turned to her, his heart racing. Neither do I, he said quietly. I don't know what it means, but I'm willing to find out. For the first time, it felt like they were both ready to take a step forward, together. The fear that had been holding them back had faded, replaced by a quiet confidence. They didn't need to have all the answers, didn't need to figure out everything at once. All they needed was the willingness to try. As the days passed, Jake and Rose continued to build something new between them. They worked side by side on the ranch, and in the evenings, they would sit together, talking about their lives, their pasts, and what the future might hold. It wasn't always easy, but it was real. And that, in itself, was enough. One evening, as the stars began to appear in the sky, Jake turned to Rose. He had spent so many years alone, living in silence, never expecting anything more. But now, standing beside her, he realized that he had something he hadn't even known he wanted. A companion, a partner, someone to share his life with. I don't know what happens next, Jake said, his voice soft but steady. But I'm glad you're here, and I want you to stay. Rose smiled, her eyes filled with warmth. I want to stay too, Jake, more than anything. They stood there for a moment, the cool evening breeze brushing against their faces, and for the first time in a long while, neither of them felt alone. They didn't know what the future would bring, but together they were ready to face it. The week had ended, but in many ways it had only just begun. What had started as a temporary arrangement had turned into something more, something real, something that neither of them had expected but both were willing to embrace. And as they stood there side by side, they knew that whatever came next, they would face it together.